Is that better, Rachel? Have to keep these people happy up the back. Otherwise they wave at me. At first I think they're being friendly, and then they keep waving, and then I realise I've done something wrong. So if someone is persistently waving at you, they might not be happy. But it is good to be here. I know Sunday school is back and we're underway again. But before we get to our study for today, let's just review the verse. This is the last Sunday that we'll have opportunity to review this verse. I think just about everybody has memorised it already. Some may have even collected their chocolates, but that is probably premature. Does anybody want to quote it before we recite it all together, the memory verse? I'm not even going to tell you the reference because I think everyone knows this. Rachel. Very good. Did you want to have a go, James? Go for it.
John chapter 3, verse 16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish but have everlasting life.
Very good. Anybody else want to piggyback off those efforts already? All right, Mr. Wallace.
John chapter 3, verse 16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life.
Very good. Now backwards. No, it's all right. Anybody else want to have a go in this very low pressure environment? Grace. Excellent. Excellent. You always hope that people do well, but I'm almost hoping someone slips up. Everyone's just got this perfect. Well done. Well done. Let's say it all together then after 2. We'll say it right through, and then this is the last time we'll do it for the month. Let's begin after 2. 1, 2. John chapter 3, verse 16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. John chapter 3, verse 16. Excellent. Let's turn to Genesis chapter 39 this morning. Genesis, very easy to locate, being the very first book in the Bible. Genesis chapter 39, and that's where we'll pick up our study for today. We have had a couple of breaks in our study. We're doing a great job of it. We got a couple of weeks in, then we had a break because I was away, and then we got one more lesson in, and then we had some holidays, which was nice. But where we're going to pick up today is Genesis chapter 39. And so what we'll do is let's just read the first verse, and then we'll do a quick revision just to get back up to speed with where we've been. So let's have a look then at Genesis chapter 39, and let's look at verse 1, where the Bible reads, And Joseph, remember that's who we're talking about, was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, that's his nationality, bought him off the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. Let's actually read verse 2. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. So right here in these verses where we're going to begin today, Joseph has arrived down in Egypt. Now, just by way of quick revision, how did we get here? How did Joseph get down to Egypt? Well, where we began our study some weeks ago was with Joseph as a 17-year-old boy. He was 17 years old and he was growing up in his father's home. His father was Jacob and his mother was Rachel. He had one brother from his mother Rachel, which was Benjamin, a younger brother, and then he had 10 other older brothers, which were from his stepmother, we could say, Leah. So he grew up, and we said that his home environment was difficult. It was challenging. There was a lot of trouble that they had there in Jacob's home. A lot of moving around, a lot of living out of tents, a lot of different cultures, different languages. They'd had a difficult life up to that point. And not only had they had external challenges, but they had internal challenges. Remember, Joseph had trouble with his brothers. They were envious of him. They were jealous of him because of his integrity. He was a man that wanted to do what was right, even as a 17-year-old boy. And even when his brothers were in opposition to him, he had a heart and a purpose to do what was right. He was a man of integrity. And so there was this tension that was brewing there at home, and ultimately it culminated in his brothers going away to look after the sheep and to look for better pastures at that time of the year. And remember, Joseph went out to look for them. He went there sent by his father to see on how they were doing. And remember, when he got there, the brothers had been conspiring against him. They'd been scheming and talking about how they might get rid of him, how they might do away with him. And ultimately they devised the plan where they would throw him in the well. And then they would take him out of that well where they had essentially abducted him and placed him for safekeeping. Well, not really safekeeping, but to hold him against his will. And then ultimately they pulled him out and they sold him to these Ishmaelite men who were merchants. They were traveling and they were selling their goods, and they were headed towards Egypt. So their intent wasn't necessarily to send him to Egypt, but that was just the way that these merchants were going, and so they were happy with that. So they sold him for a very small price to these men, and they took the coat, that precious coat that Joseph had, and they dipped it in blood. And where we left off of that part of the story, they'd taken it back to Jacob, and they told him a lie that an animal had gotten to Joseph and that he was dead. And Jacob believed the lie, and he was in great grieving and in great mourning because this was his son. This was the one that he loved, perhaps more than the others. This was the one that was his favourite, and he thought in his mind, now he's dead, he was gone. And so Jacob was inconsolable with grief that he had there at that time. Now, the last time we studied in this passage, we looked through chapter 38, and we talked about the fact that chapter 38 doesn't necessarily focus on the life of Joseph or Jacob, but it talks about his elder brother, Judah. And we talked about the immorality and the really difficult life that Judah had, looking in parallel to Joseph's life, about Joseph, a man of integrity, a man of character, a man that wanted to do what was right. And in contrast to that, we see Judah, whose life was a mess. His life was all over the place. His sons died because of their rebellion against God. And ultimately his daughter-in-law, he had a sexual relationship with her, with Tamar, and children were born from that, and just a real mess of a situation. But in all of the mess, we highlighted one key thought, and that was the fact that even in Judah's mess, God was still working for good. And even in contrast to Joseph's story, we see God working for good through a man of integrity, Joseph. In Judah's story, we see God working for good through a train wreck. And that's the beauty of what God can do. He can work through both kinds of stories. And that's where we get to chapter 39, where we go back now. So we've gone back in time, because remember we said in Judah's story at the end of chapter 38, we're actually fast forwarded a bit from here. So now we're going to step back a number of years to when Joseph is a younger man, and he's arrived now in Egypt. He's been taken down there by these merchant men, and he arrives there in Egypt. And so this is a daunting thing, and I want us to understand just the gravity of Joseph arriving here. Now, he's not old. He's 17 or 18, and he's arriving in a foreign nation, a nation that he's never been to before, a nation that he doesn't speak the language or understand the culture. He doesn't know anybody. He doesn't have any friends. His family are not there. And beyond all of that, he's a slave. So he has no rights. He has no ability to move around freely or do whatever he wants to do. He's at the mercy of the people who now own him. But in all of this, right from the beginning, we see God's providence in Joseph's life. And you say, well, how do we see God's providence? Well, think about where Joseph ends up. Out of millions of households in Egypt that he could have ended up in, he ends up in the house of Potiphar. Now, we don't have much detail about how that process went down, whether it was at an auction that he was purchased, or whether it was a deal that was made privately, whether he was headhunted. We don't know how he got to Potiphar's house. But long story short, he got there, and we know that that was God. We know that that was God working in Joseph's life to put him exactly where he needed to be. And we're going to see that. So Joseph's now in Egypt, and he's going to face some challenges in Egypt. We're going to see kind of two parts to the lesson this morning, whereby in the first part we're going to see the good side of what was going on, where things were going a bit better, a bit more calm, a bit more peaceful for Joseph. And then things are going to get much more difficult for him. So we're going to see a bit of a contrast here in how things went. But in all of this, we're going to see God's presence is constant in Joseph's life. And in particular, we're going to see God's presence in his temptation. Because this chapter here, you're going to recognize the verses. These are one of the most well-known parts of Joseph's story. And this is something that had a great impact as to the end of the story. Because without this part of the story, we don't get to where Joseph arrives at the end of his story. But we see here God's presence in our temptation. I want you to ask yourself this morning, have you ever found yourself wanting to do something you know you shouldn't do? Just think on that for a moment. Have you ever found yourself wanting or felt an urge to do something that you know is not right? And that can even happen before you're a Christian. That can happen where you have a voice inside, and we call it the conscience. And it's put there by God, and it's a moral conscience that God gives us, that is that voice inside our head that tells us that we know certain things are right and wrong. Have you noticed in society people intuitively know certain things are wrong? Like if I was to go across the road and to try and forcibly enter the house there, people would automatically say that's wrong. People have, even outside of the Bible, there's this knowledge, and we call that the conscience, that God has placed there within individuals whereby they intuitively know that certain things are not right. Now that can be suppressed and people can push back on that, but there is that voice there that tells them certain things are right and wrong. If you go and kill somebody, most people in society would agree that that's wrong. And so we understand that we have a basic moral framework which underpins our society. And ultimately that does go back to the Bible and our Christian roots. And that's something that is a blessing for us. But there is that conscience within people. And so even for unsaved people, and particularly for Christian people as well, there is that inner witness, we could call it, that tells us that certain things are wrong. Have you ever felt the urge to go against that though? And that's something that I've felt many times, and you've probably felt too, where there's times where we feel like a better outcome could be gained by pushing back, by doing things another way. Sometimes it's just so that we might get an advantage. It might be lying in a business dealing, or lying or being dishonest at work to try and get a better outcome for yourself. Or it could be something more simple than that, where it's just something we desire, where we want something. Like that's ultimately what theft is born from, is covetousness, that desire to have something that someone else has. Or when we are jealous, like Joseph's brothers here in this story, we want the peace that somebody else has. That bothers us. The integrity that some other individual has, well, that's troubling to us, because I want the peace that they have, but I can't have it. So now we become jealous of that. And these are all things that fall under what we could call a broader banner, which is temptation. And so we're going to speak broadly about temptation this morning, but we're going to see a specific example of it here in the story. So while we're going to make a very general application, there's a very specific way that it plays out here. And I think that from this, what we can glean will be very helpful for each and every one of us as we face our own temptations. You might not face the specific temptation Joseph faces right here. In fact, probably none of us ever will. But we can learn and glean lessons and applications from it, which will help us in our own life. So let's see how this story unfolds here. So we know that Joseph's arrived in Egypt. And for those that are interested in history, there's a lot we could say about the timing of this as far as Egyptian history goes. Now, I would love to be able to say to you with great confidence that I could tell you exactly which Pharaoh was in charge here at this period in history. But as Brother Wallace could tell you, there's a little bit of conjecture about exactly which one it was. There was a couple of good candidates in this time period, but we're basically looking at the 12th dynasty of Egypt, so approximately 1800 BC. And you could say 1900 BC to 1700, somewhere in that time frame. So there are some good candidates for which pharaoh it was, but needless to say, it's in that time period. So we're about 1800 years before Christ steps on the scene here, and we're in Egypt, ancient Egypt, and it's definitely before the Hyksos period where foreign kings ruled in Egypt itself. And we'll see more about that a little bit later on, because that's pertinent to the end of Joseph's story, when a new pharaoh came up that didn't know Joseph, and that ties in with this Hyksos period in Egyptian history. But one thing we do know about this period in history, just to say one thing on Egypt's state at that time, is that when Joseph arrives in Egypt, they were in a resurgence. The power of the state was increasing again. They were in a rebuilding phase. A lot of power had gone back to the pharaoh. And so we could say that things were becoming more ordered as far as their governmental structures go. And so we see here, and that fits very well with what we'll see with Potiphar and the officers that Pharaoh was appointing and that were serving him. There was a lot more structure that was taking place here. So Joseph has arrived here in Egypt, and he's now a slave in this foreign country. But we read there in verse 2 a very important truth, that the Lord was with Joseph. So even though he has arrived in this place, God was with him. And we're going to see that come up again. Have a look at verse 3 with me. Verse 3, he's in the house here, and it says, and his master, that's Potiphar, saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. Look at verse 4. And Joseph found grace in his sight and served him, and he made him overseer over his house and all that he had put into his hand. So Joseph is a slave now. He's in the house of Potiphar. Who's Potiphar? Well, he is an officer for Pharaoh. Now, it says there that he's an officer, he's a captain of the guard, so he's a man of high standing. Some have suggested he could have been in charge of the corps of guards that were responsible for the Pharaoh's personal protection. And some other good ideas are also that he was involved with the judicial system, which would help us understand slightly why Joseph was cast into prison in just a few short verses later. But he was a man of great means, he was a man of great power, and a man of great authority. And Joseph is in his house, and Joseph is serving him as a slave. But we see there this important truth, and it's mentioned a couple of times. The Lord was with Joseph, then his master saw the Lord was with him, and then we see that he found grace. So there was favour that was found in the eyes of this man. So as Joseph was living his life serving, remember he's not a pastor here, he's not even a missionary here. He's not really done or said a whole lot, but what he has done is he served faithfully. As he went about his household tasks as a slave, cleaning, maintenance, serving, waiting on. Even in these mundane tasks of life, his master is seeing the fact that God is with him. There's something different about him. And that is an amazing thought to me, that this unsaved man, who's probably never met a Christian in his life, he's never met a believer, a God-fearer, a person that serves the one true God, but he can see something in this young man, 18 years old, in the way he's serving, in the way he's conducting himself. He can see that there's something supernatural about this. This is out of the ordinary. And that's amazing to me. And that's God working in Joseph's life. We see there that God was with him. And other people see that as well. And then we see the fact that God is prospering him. God's blessing Joseph here in this circumstance. God is, to put it in our terms, is turning everything that he touches into gold. And we see that in verse 4. And he becomes an overseer in the house. Did you see that in verse 4? He becomes an overseer in Potiphar's house, and all that he had, that's what Potiphar had, he put into his hand. Look at verse 5, it continues, and it came to pass from the time that he made him overseer in his house, and over all that he had, look what happens, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And verse 6 continues, and he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had. He didn't even know what he had so much stuff, save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favoured. So we see in all of this that God is blessing Joseph now. Joseph is walking uprightly. He's doing the best he can with God's help. Other people are seeing that in his life, and now he's risen up to a position of prominence. So he's gone from being a slave, the lowest, most mistreated person in the house, to now being the overseer. So this man has seen the trustworthiness, the reliability, the dependability that Joseph has and has demonstrated right from the ground up. And now Joseph is overseeing and managing the whole household. He's in charge of the other servants. He's in charge of the children. He's in charge of all the aspects of this man's house. Even the finances, it tells us, and the fields. The means that he had, Joseph is now overseeing all of that. And that's God lifting him up. That's God blessing him. And he becomes this overseer, and there's so much trust in Joseph from Potiphar demonstrated that it even tells us that he didn't even know what he had anymore. If you ask Potiphar, what about this and what about that? He'll say, I don't know, ask Joseph. He knows, he's in charge of it all. And it tells us only the bread that he ate, so only what was right in front of him, he knew what he had, and what Joseph was able to do was to look after the whole house, and now Potiphar can focus on his other roles, on his other responsibilities. But as far as the home front goes, Joseph is now in charge of it all. And understand, this is not a small household. This is not a 2-bedroom house with a single bathroom. This is a palace. This is a big place. This is a man who is esteemed by Pharaoh. And Pharaoh's palace, man, that was splendid. And they were very extravagant, the Egyptians. They would build big palaces and big buildings, and this was a big place. Potiphar, as a high-ranking official for Pharaoh, would have lived in a very nice place with lots of people. It wouldn't have just been him and his wife and maybe a couple of kids. There would have been other people living there. And it would have been a busy place, and there was agricultural endeavours going on. So lots of things happening, but Joseph's in charge of all of it in just a very short period of time. And that's how God blesses him. So life in Potiphar's house for Joseph was, well, it was seemingly going well. And we see here that when we walk with God as we should, because remember that's where it started. Joseph was not a manager going to apply for a manager's position here. Joseph started as a servant, and he started by walking with God. And we see here that when you walk with God first, God takes care of the rest. And God blesses Joseph here as he walks with him. So notice the order that Joseph walks with God first. His presence, God's presence is evident in Joseph's life, and that's when God begins to use him. And that's very relevant for us. As we want to serve God, as we want God to bless our lives, the key here is to walk with God first. If we try and serve God first, we get the order wrong, and what ends up happening is we become disappointed. We become frustrated. And that's what can happen, but the case here was Joseph walks with God first. He senses God's presence in his life, and God begins to bless him. So God's presence is a reality in Joseph's life, so much so that it's mentioned again and again. It's mentioned several times over, which is important. So this is what life in Potiphar's house was like. But not all was smooth sailing. So let's see the next part of this. And this will be where we'll spend the rest of our time this morning. Joseph's temptation. What could possibly go wrong here? We'll have a look there at let's read the end of verse 6 again. It says, and Joseph was a goodly person and well favoured. Now that means that Joseph was a good-looking young man. He was well-mannered. He was well-presented. And he was, to use the H word, he was a handsome guy. He was a good-looking guy, and he was well-presented, and he was well-favoured, so he was well-respected. So not just in character, the Bible tells us that his appearance was good-looking as well. So in character he was good, and in looks he was good. And so what ends up happening is, we'll look at verse 7. And it came to pass after these things that we've just talked about, that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph, and she said, lie with me. So she makes this appeal to him. And in verse 8 we see, but he refused, and said unto his master's wife, notice carefully what he said, behold, my master, that's Potiphar, wotteth not what is with me in the house. He doesn't know what is even in the house. And he hath committed all that he hath to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? It's recorded for us very clearly there what Joseph's response here to her appeal was. So in all of these things that are going on, things are going well for Joseph. God is blessing. His favor is evident in his life. Now there's going to come a curveball for Joseph. And this is going to be the next test. The first test was when he got to Egypt and how things played out. Now this is really the second big test for him. Is now he's going to be in a compromising position. A really compromising position. Because this is not just a random person. This is not just a person that he's met somewhere along the roadside or out at a social event. This is a person that lives in the same household as him. And this is the person that really can put him in the most jeopardy out of anybody in the household. Because she's the only one that could get in Potiphar's ear other than Joseph. She was the only one that Potiphar would possibly believe above Joseph. And so Joseph is going to be in a really difficult position here because she's making this sexual appeal to him. She's identified him. She's seen him there as a good guy. And she's decided now that she wants him. And she is, obviously, we're not talking about a safe person here. She's just acting on her own desires, her own wants, and her own things that she has that she's trying to achieve in life. So she makes this appeal to him, and we read there that he refused. So Joseph's initial response was refuse. And he didn't just refuse and walk away. He could have just said, no, I'm not interested, or that's not my thing. But he actually gives a really detailed answer as to why he would not. And we read that there, and he talks about the fact that his master has given him a position. His master trusts him. He highlights the trust that Potiphar has in him. And he points out that everything in the house is really under Joseph's jurisdiction except for her. And there's a reason for that because she is his wife. So he points that out. And ultimately he concludes in the end of verse 9, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And that's the most important part. Because Joseph could have given all of the reasons that he gave at first about the trust that Potiphar had, the relationship they had, the fact that she's married and this would be adultery. He gives all of the correct reasons, but if it's just those and you leave off the last one, then ultimately it's still up for negotiation. I mean, we can negate and try and rebuild trust, or I can just go work somewhere else. Like, there are ways to try and dismiss this. But without this last and most important reason, we really will get away from it. But we see there this core reason. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And it's important that we understand, as we talk about temptation, that ultimately all sin is against God. Joseph, if he had have gone through with this, he would have sinned against Potiphar, yes. He would have sinned against himself. He would have sinned against this woman. He would have sinned against all of the people in the household. But ultimately he recognizes that his sin would have been against God. Because this would have been a transgression of God's law, not his law, not Pharaoh's law. This was a transgression of God's law. In fact, this was probably something that would have been rampant. I mean, much like today. This sort of thing happens all the time in workplaces, in businesses, in homes. This is way too common in society, this kind of impurity. But Joseph was here in this position, and he recognizes that there are lots of reasons why I shouldn't do this, and they're all true. But ultimately, you have to bring God into it. And ultimately, this would be sin against God. And so that is his final answer, that he's not going to go through with it. But notice in verse 10, she's obviously not getting the message. It says in verse 10, and it came to pass as she spake to Joseph, notice the words here, day by day. So she's pestering him every day, that he hearken not unto her to lie by her or to be with her. So Joseph's creating some space here as best he can, because she's trying to make this advance toward him. He's pushing back. Now he's trying to create some space. So he's trying to keep his distance as best he can from her appeal to him. And it says in verse 11, we'll see the last part of this, and it came to pass about this time that Joseph went into the house to do his business. That's something he would have done many times over. And there was none of the men in the house there within. You can see the trouble brewing. And she caught him by the garment, saying, lie with me. And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out. And it came to pass, when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and was fled forth, that she called unto the men of the house, and spake unto them, saying, See, he hath brought in an Hebrew unto us to mock us. He came in unto me to lie with me, and I cried with a loud voice. And it came to pass, when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled, and got him out. And she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home. And then she goes on to continue to lie about the situation. So we see here, well, what does she do here? So Joseph has not been relenting in his pushing back against this. Joseph has made a decision. I am not going to be part and parcel to this. I'm not going to give in to this. But she keeps persisting. She keeps putting it forward again and again in a repetitive way. And it's important that we understand a little bit about who this lady was. Again, she's the wife of Potiphar. She's a woman of prominence. And I would even say she would have been a beautiful woman. Being married to Potiphar, one of the highest ranking officials in Egypt, she would have been a beautiful woman that would have been desired by many. And a lot of people probably would have liked to be in Joseph's position. But Joseph was determined that regardless of the temptation here, regardless of how much incentive there was to do the wrong thing, his resolve was to do what was right. And so even though she was at him every day, it says day by day, she kept putting this to him again and again. She's nagging him with it. And the easy thing to do for him would have been to succumb. This is hard. I mean, it's easy enough to say once no, but then to say it again and again and tomorrow and next week and the next week. She's persistent with him. And so it's not just a one-off temptation. This is something that he's having to deal with on an ongoing basis. And it's not something he can just walk away from either. Because he's ultimately, even though he's the manager of the household now, he's still a slave. He's still the property of this household. And he can't just leave. He can't just say, you know what, I've had enough working here. This is a toxic environment and I'm out. Yeah, I mean, you could do that today. Call up HR, I'm done here, they're harassing me, and you can leave. But he couldn't do that. He could not do that. He couldn't just go somewhere else. He was stuck here. He was stuck in this very compromising situation. And this temptation would have been strong and repetitive. But notice that Joseph doesn't make any kind of excuse here. He could have just done it, and then he could have made excuses for it later and said things that you hear people say all the time, like, I couldn't help it, I was in a bad situation, there was pressure on me. I mean, he could have made any number of excuses here, but he doesn't. He's resolute and determined to keep himself pure and to push back on this wrongdoing, not knowing where it would take him. Because honestly, he doesn't know where this is going to lead. And we read there what ends up happening is the inevitable happens. She gets frustrated. Ultimately, she tries to forcibly grab him and take him and be with him. And ultimately, he runs. He leaves his coat there and he runs for his life. He just runs out of the house. He flees from this compromising situation. And he knew full well what could come from that, or what would come from that. And that's what happened. She made these false accusations against him. And then ultimately, he ends up in prison. We're going to see that next week, how he ends up in a jail cell because of these false accusations. And we look at it, and we read it now looking back at history, and we see so plainly, like, he was just trying to do what was right. He was trying to do the honourable thing. He was trying to save a marriage. He was trying to save a home. He was trying to keep himself pure. And he ends up being wrongly accused. He becomes the scapegoat for all of this. But he was determined to not allow this to happen to him, and he wasn't worried about the consequences. He would allow that to take care of itself. He knew that God had brought him this far, and God could continue to take him on in his journey no matter what would happen. He was just determined to do the right thing in his situation. And it's important we see here that we read at the beginning a lot of wording along the lines of God being with him. Now, God didn't abandon him here. But we stopped reading those terms, but you have to understand God is still with him. And you're going to see that next week. You're going to say, well, how is God with him then if this terrible thing happens to him again? Well, the same way God was with him the first time. when he ended up being abducted by his brothers, remember? They beat him, they put him in the well. God was with him then, and God is with him now, even in this compromising situation. And it's easy for us to look at this and think, why? I mean, why is this happening to a good guy? I mean, have you ever asked those sort of questions? Why? You know, why did this happen to me? Or why did this happen to so-and-so? But why am I in this position? And it's easy for us to look at these why questions in life. But really, the only way to fully understand the why questions of life is to step back and to see life from God's point of view. And we're going to see that right at the end of Joseph's story, because the camera lens zooms right back and we get the picture of what God was doing over 40 years. God's plan was over 30 or 40 years. Don't get lost in the small detail of one event. And that's what God is doing here. So when we have these why questions, look at the big picture and see God's presence even in this temptation. God was with Joseph, and Joseph would not give in to this temptation. Now I want to just close with a couple of applications here, because we look at this and we say, well, Joseph got through this somehow. How did he get through it? Well, let's look at a couple of applications, because temptation can be overcome when we rely on God's power and presence with us. It can be overcome. Now, I would caveat that by saying, though, you can't in your own strength. You can't beat temptation on your own. Remember how we talked about those desires that we have, the things that we want to do that we know are not quite right? You can't just beat that on willpower. It won't last. You might be able to beat it for a day. Have you ever noticed that? When you just try and muster up enough pushback, you can keep away from that thing that's a grip in your life for a day or two, and then it comes back again. The next time you find yourself in a compromising situation where everybody around you is laughing at that thing that they think is funny, or whatever it may be, and when you're in that situation, it's just so easy to just go back to it again. That's what it's like in life so often. But we can overcome temptation by God's power in us. So you can't on your own, but God working in you can. So let's have a look at I've got here 5 applications that we can take away from this as we close out this morning in Joseph's temptation. We can see here that overcoming temptation cannot happen by accident. It cannot happen by accident. And we see that in Joseph's story. He wasn't just hoping that everything would work out okay. He wasn't just pretending that there wasn't a problem there and that I can just somehow ignore the problem and it'll just dissipate on its own. No, Joseph had to take steps to prepare for this. He was a man of integrity, a man of character. This was not the first time he'd been confronted with a problem or a temptation. But Joseph had prepared himself for this moment. And when this moment came, well, he had preparation to rely upon. See, when the pressure's on, that's not the time you start preparing. Think of it this way: if you were playing some sport and you had a competition or a tournament, you don't start practicing the morning of, or you don't start practicing when the whistle goes and the game starts. That's time. Practice is done then. The pressure's on, and your preparation becomes exposed. And so the same is with temptation. When temptation arrives and you find yourself in this situation where someone is saying to you, do this, what's going to come out is the preparation up to that point. If you've been making good decisions and walking with God in the lead up, you're going to be in a much better position to stand up against that temptation. If you just don't even think about it and you don't ever consider the fact that you might be tested, well, you're going to find it difficult. When the pressure is up, the lack of preparation is exposed. So overcoming temptation cannot happen by accident. It must be overcome intentionally. The second thing that we can take away from this is that reliance on our own strength and resolve will only lead to frustration and disappointment. Again, if you just try and muster up enough pushback, I'm just going to hold out and I'm going to try and bottle up my feelings and my desires, and that only lasts for so long. And then you succumb again, you give in to that thing again, and then you become frustrated, you become disappointed, and the cycle continues. And that's what can happen. So where do we look then? If reliance on our own strength is not enough, well, we need something beyond us. And that's we need God's help in this. And that's what Joseph had. Remember, the Lord was with him. Other people could see that in his life, that God was with him. So Joseph had something real and tangible in his life that was the framework by which he could push back. This wasn't just Joseph's best effort to push back. This was God working in him to push back on this temptation. So we cannot rely on our own strength. Our strength must come directly from God. Thirdly, this morning, our sin will ultimately have great effect on those around us in either a positive or a negative way. And what do I mean by that? Well, our actions have consequences beyond what we sometimes intend. And so you might think, well, my temptation is just about me and my trouble. And that's true. But it's also true that what you do has impact on people around you. None of us live in isolation. We all live in communities, in families. And when you push back like Joseph did, and you don't give in to that thing that seems convenient to do and you know is wrong, other people get strength and courage from that. Look at the fact that we're talking about Joseph's behavior many, many years later. We're getting inspiration and gleaning the teaching here from Joseph's decision to walk with God and to do the right thing. So our decisions and our actions can have a great impact. Now, had Joseph done the opposite, well, maybe we'd be talking about him in a different light. We might be talking about him as the example of what not to do. And I'm thankful we're not. We're talking about what we should do. But our actions, again, have consequences beyond what we sometimes intend. So ultimately, our life does have an impact on those around us. So keep that in mind. As you're tempted, as you're tested, remember that other people are watching and they will be impacted. The fourth thing here, and second last, is we must take practical steps to keep ourselves from opportunities to sin. And notice we didn't have lots of time to stay there. We had to move through it kind of quickly. But Joseph was taking practical steps. Did you see that? How he explained to her why. He took the time to explain why he wouldn't do what she was asking him to do. Did you see the fact that he created space and distance from her? She would ask him, come and be with me, and he would say no, and he would remove himself. He would move to another part of the house. He would try as best he could to avoid contact because he knew what was going to happen. See, these are all practical steps. These are practical things that you can do. Now, you would need to identify practical steps in your own temptation because these that he had might not be relevant to you unless you're facing the same thing he's facing. But there are practical steps you can do to try and avoid putting yourself in these situations. So often the temptation to sin comes from the environment that we put ourselves in. If you put yourself in a bad situation, you're going to end up in trouble. Look at the chapter before, what we talked about a few weeks ago with Judah. He went on that trip, remember, with his friend Hira, and they went up on the way, and he was looking for a prostitute. Remember, he put himself in that situation, and then he had the trouble with Tamar. He put himself in a bad situation. So it's no surprise then that he ends up in a terrible way because he's put himself there. So don't think that you're big enough or strong enough to be able to just endure any situation. Some situations, the best way and the only way to protect yourself is to remove yourself from it. Trying to walk through the fire and not get burnt doesn't often work unless you're a fireman. So don't try and walk through the fire. Take practical steps to keep yourself from opportunities. Identify what are areas of weakness and try and create practical steps in that. And then the last thing, and the last application I've got here is doing the right thing is always the right thing to do, even when it comes with unintended consequences. So it's one thing to think about now and to think about the future, but ultimately what happens in the future, we have to leave that with God. You don't make a decision in your present situation solely based off what you think might happen in the future. Our resolve should be to do what is right in the present, always. Because it's always the right thing to do what's right today. Amen. Now, sometimes that comes with problems down the road, and it did for Joseph. It puts him in prison. But that wasn't going to change how he behaved. He didn't think, well, I might end up in prison if I do the right thing, so that's justification to do this and commit adultery. No, he wasn't going to put himself in that position. His determination was to do what was right and to leave the rest with God. And that should be the same for you and I. That our determination should be to do what's right all the time. Even if that comes with a consequence later on, that's not ours to worry about. God will give grace. And we see that in Joseph's life. God gives him grace in each stage of life. Regardless of what happens, God is blessing and God is with him. So for you and I this morning, keep in mind, God is with us even in our temptation. And God can bring good out of it, even though sometimes it doesn't look like there could be anything good coming from that. But as we walk with God, as we see God's presence in our life, God helps us to overcome even the most difficult temptations like Joseph faced here. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for our time this morning. And Lord, we've talked a lot about this passage and how we can apply it in our lives. Lord, I pray that you would help each one here. Help us to see the victory over sin and the things that so easily weigh us down. Lord, help us in your power and in your strength to be overcomers so that we can walk the lives that you would have us to in your power and by your enabling. Lord, we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.